What do I consider to be a guide to Welsh history? And where do you start if you've never really read it or your only knowledge of it comes from a shaky memory from high school? Well, let's do a little bit of investigating, shall we? We'll talk about a few of the books I've had over the years and kind of how best to go about it when you don't necessarily live in an area where it's easy to come by the books. Creoso, and welcome back to the Welsh History Podcast. This is our Freeform edition, episode number 17, and a Canadian's Guide to Welsh History. So, in the past, I have talked a little bit about some of the books I have purchased for myself for educating history and to try and get an idea about Welsh history. But I kind of wanted today to talk about it not from the website or the podcast mentality, but rather from as someone who's coming into it either new, don't really know where to start, maybe you have an interest area that you're curious about and you kind of want to follow up on that. So I wanted to kind of give some examples, just as kind of an overview. It's nothing, everybody has different ideas of what they like about history and aspects of history. If you're listening to this podcast, I'm assuming you have an interest in Welsh history and or just a curiosity about it. And with that in mind, I kind of wanted to just go over a few of the ones that I've come across over the years, and specifically the ones I use from day to day, and how much they've influenced kind of my thought process when it comes to this. So the first book that I really read cover to cover that had to do with a version of Welsh history and was kind of an overview of Welsh history as a whole, but I think it was kind of an interesting book because it gave me a little bit of snippets of effectively the writer's idea of what someone like Owen Glyndwr was going through as far as what their perspective might have been because of this or because of that, or maybe they're talking a little bit about one of the famous poets and bards of the time period in the Middle Ages and kind of talking a bit more about them. And it did influence some of my reading, and that was called The Small Matter of Wales. It was a book that I bought in the 80s. I repurchased it in the 90s and had kept it for a number of years. And it was one of the first ones that I ever read, and it was one of the first ones to introduce me to a lot of principles about Welsh history that I really didn't think about. It's a fairly small book, which in history that can be good. It's not necessarily easy to find these days, just simply because it's not a new book. But the big difference is you can buy it for under $20 in Canada and probably in the States, and for less than that, much less than that in Wales. And currently it's published by Penguin Publishing, so it's got a big publisher behind it, which is helpful. And it's soft cover, and that also is very helpful. So for me, that was one that was pinnacle in getting me started on this hunt. It's just a random book I found in the library, to be fair. That's the other thing. It was a library book initially that I started reading, and then I just bought it later when I had more money. And it was kind of how I got started in Welsh history. The next book I read, I honestly, I've tried to search my brain to remember what the name of it is, and unfortunately I'm coming up blank. But I think if you want a good overview book, one that I have mentioned on this podcast before, it's one that I actually still use to this day. It's sitting on my desk somewhere. And it's A History of Wales by John Davies. It's a good overview. It's an older book where he's gone back and done later editions and he's added bits and pieces to it because of that. But I think it does a great job of giving you the overall sense of what's going on in Wales. So if you don't have time to sort of focus in on multiple books, or maybe you don't know what part of the history you're interested in, that's definitely a book to read because it goes all the way through to the modern day. It's very concise. It can be a bit academic, so if that's a concern, this is kind of why I started with The Small Matter of Wales, because it isn't as academically written, even though it's an academic-ish book. I feel like it's a little bit less academic in nature, which I think is helpful for a lot of people who aren't looking for that kind of quality. But it does give you a good overview. It talks about a lot of the big stories of Wales, which I think is important. And then it'll let you know kind of as you read it, what areas would I be interested in. And so the next book I'm going to bring up, and the next book that I think has always been one that I love, and it's a very small, cheap book, but I really do like it quite a bit, and that is The Welsh Kings, Warriors, Warlords, and Princes. And it's a book that was written by Carrie Mond, and it is an excellent book. It does focus strictly in on the early days of medieval Welsh kings all the way up to the end of the kings and princes with David ap Griffith. And that, I think, is it's a great little taster, if you want to call it that. If you're not really thinking that you can get through a large book, this is definitely one that's easy to get through. It is much smaller. You can carry it around and not have to heave a lot of stuff. It costs, relatively inexpensive. It comes in paperback version, which is inexpensive, but even less expensive in Kindle or some sort of ebook version. And it's only 240 pages, so it's not massive. It's not going to, take a lot of time, but you can listen to it. You can read it and get a good understanding of what's going on with relatively inexpensive book. And I highly recommend it, because if you're interested in the medieval Welsh kings, this is going to give you a very good overview of it all. And it does a really nice job with a very, someone with an academic background, but they're not talking in an academic way. So if you're trying to get an idea of things without driving yourself insane, that's one way to do it. And like I said, it's relatively inexpensive, so that is a plus. It was written in 2005, so it's relatively modern. It's not like brand new, but it's not so dated that it would be completely useless in some respects or have a lot of really hokey ideas. But I think it's really good at trying to capture the symbolism and the imagery that you're wanting to get out of that kind of section. And it offers a unique perspective because it's taking all of the different things. There are books in this that I've read where the books themselves can be so dry and academic that they will drive you insane. There's a couple of books that I own which I can only read them kind of sectionally. To read them back to front is not possible because it's so hard with the way it's written. So I won't be recommending them, but they are very good. If you're interested in academics, they're very much an academic book, which I think is useful. Next on the list is The Welsh Language, A History by Janet Davies. If you've listened to the episodes where I've talked about the Welsh language, you've heard me mention Janet's writings a few times. She is very, very good in this topic. She knows a lot. She talks a lot about it. She talks about the developments in Welsh from its earliest Brythonic to its latter current day history. And I think it does a really good job of giving you an overview of the language. So if you want to know what the language is about, to me, that's a really good one. It offers a lot of insight into how things are said. It's not going to give you an overview. Like if you're wanting to learn the language, that's not what it's about. It's about giving you a history of how we got here. How did the history of Wales and the language that bred the culture grow together, and what was the reason why it survived when so many of the other Celtic languages struggled and suffered and in some cases went extinct. So that's kind of the beginning point. So if we're talking about you're just wanting to read an overview of history and you're wanting a specific book which makes it easier, these are the ones that I think do make it easier. They're not speculative books. They're basically academic related, but they're not academically written in the same way. You would possibly use this for a university class, but you could also read it just because, and it would work just because. It's not necessary to have it in both formats or have a translator effectively for it. And there are some books definitely I have found in the past that while they're really good for the subject matter they're talking about, they can be quite rough to read through. Now, conversely, there are books on the early history and conflict that are written from people who lived at least relatively close to the day in the medieval and early medieval period, especially. So, one of the first, of course, is Gildas. Gildas was a monk living in the 6th century and was a Welsh monk who basically, let's just put it this way, he called everybody out on their nonsense and definitely was very strongly opposed to a lot of the current leaders of the day and thought that they were doing a very poor job. And a lot of them were based in Wales, we think. The thought process is that he was generally writing to the Welsh princes or the Welsh kings rather than to, specifically across all of Britain. And the reasons for that could be because he was based in that area. It could also be that he didn't have a lot of experience outside of there, or because he was born there, he knew the area. So the writing is more difficult to read because, first of all, it's translated from Latin, which makes it difficult in and of itself because you're reading an English translation of a Latin book. However, it is one of the rare things that we don't see a lot of, which is actual original source books that relate to Wales. He is definitely writing about a period where the Roman Britons have fallen. The Romans, according to the book, have left, and everybody is trying to fend for themselves, but in an era when it's all broken up, there's no cohesion amongst the leadership. And in the meantime, at the very least, the Saxon culture has been spreading, and its pagan roots bother Gildas as much as anything. And the other thing to keep in mind is it's written from a very biblical standpoint, which you understand because he's a monk. He's not writing it from the standpoint of a modern day scholar. He's writing it from someone who has an agenda. And that's always good to keep in mind when you're reading these early writers. They don't tend to have, they're writing to their day and they're writing a polemic typically. So they're writing an advocacy book effectively, calling out the local leadership. So that's something to keep in mind. And he spends a lot of time attacking the leaders of Britain for how useless they've been in defending the country against the Saxons. And he uses a lot of biblical imagery because what he's doing is he's making it a comparison to old Israel and biblical, Babylonian invasion sort of stuff. And it's that comparison he's making which stands out because he's basically, writing a religious sermon, not writing a history book. So with all that in mind, you can still pick out bits and pieces out of it where he's talking about the history of it. And what we learn later, of course, is that gets lifted into the writings that come after. Almost every writer talking about this period will lift from this particular document because it's the earliest one that remains, and it's the one that you really don't have a choice to use, right? Otherwise, you're going to be stuffed because there's just not enough material, for lack of a better word. The ideas and the concepts that he's bringing in, of course, have to be understood from the context of the day. He's not talking about it from the concepts with a modern lens, and he doesn't necessarily know the actual history of the area he's at. So he's quoting a lot of history that is not actually accurate, basically. Now, of course, a companion book with that, and one that's quite frequently taken slightly more seriously by scholars, but I think that's just simply because it's more history looking than the other, is the Ecclesiastical History of the English People, written by Bede. The reason why a lot of scholars, especially in Wales, will use this book is because Bede spends a lot of time talking about the British people and the fact he gives a lot of back history to what we know of as the Saxon invasion. And it's obviously stuff that a writer writing in the 8th century is going to have 200 years of myth and legend to go along with the actual history and story. So a lot of what he's writing, it can be taken with a grain of salt because of that. And unfortunately, that is one of the aspects to these books that you have to, again, keep in mind that they aren't as simple as you just go and say, oh, well, this is this and that's that. You have to kind of drill down a bit, but it's still a really, really good overview of the conflict. You get some really interesting characters in here for the first time. And I think his book is one that is a bit more readable just simply because it is and has been studied so much that people do work on it more. So translations can be a bit better. And it is one that will be published because, and I say this bluntly, because it's an English textbook, effectively. So many more people are curious about it. There's a lot more wrapped up into it. But the funny part of it all is it's really just a Northern English book. Much like Nennius, who we've talked about in the past from the 9th century, is writing the Welsh perspective of history, but based in a Northern perspective. And so everything's based around that idea that the kingdom of Gwynedd is always right. Bede's perspective is always built around the areas around Yorkshire and the north, and it's very focused on that. So Northumbria and all of those kingdoms and areas and counties all have a little bit more importance to what he's writing because that's where, again, that's where he's living. So, and that's where he's from. It definitely influences his perspective. So, like, if you think about it, the Saxon king Penda, who ends up aligning himself with the kings of Gwynedd in order to invade Northumbria, is considered to be quite the brigand in Bede's story, but yet he's very much you know, a positive force in Welsh history. He's a negative to the Northumbrians because of what he did. And so all of these different things have a relationship in the story, which I think are interesting. And if you're wanting to read, if you want to get away from reading just a secondhand account of it, that's one way to go about and read firsthand written accounts. How close they are to firsthand, of course, is everybody's guess. But, someone who has lived in an era around the time that all this is going on and definitely has an opinion on everything is worth the read if that's what you want to do. If you want to get that much into the nitty gritty of the history, that's one way to do it. Now, if you're looking at like Owen Glyndwr, I have noted that because of the recent anniversaries, especially in the last 10 to 15 years, there has been a lot more of books that have been written about him and a lot more discussion about the relationship that he had with various different people. And I think probably, I mean, the one I used quite frequently and I quite like, and again, it's not a very big book, but it's quite well written. And I think gives us a good perspective on the revolt in general, at least in an overview sense. Keep in mind that all of these books are overviews when we're talking about the secondhand books. They're not going into great depth. If you want to go into great depth, there's lots of different authors you can read and find. And the good news is most of them are either on Kindle or they're got through places like Amazon. We'll talk about other options as well, especially if you're wanting to get older books that aren't for sale via a place like Amazon. Obviously, some people don't want to buy from Amazon, so let's talk about that as well. But the first book I would mention is Owen Glyndwr, Prince of Wales, from R.R. Davies. Really, really good book. A book that is relatively compact again. It is, and does give you a great overview of everything. I typically found it really simple to read. And that in and of itself is wonderful. And you can kind of skim through it or you can read it in depth. It's up to you. There are a lot of Owen Glendower books. I'm not recommending any of these that you specifically should buy, but I think they are some of the better ones out there. Roland Jones did a Glendower book, which is the story of the Owen Glendower and the Welsh Braveheart. That's an interesting perspective if you want a little different viewpoint. Another one that I read, which I quite liked, was Owen Glendower by Terry Breverton. Another really good, easy to read, relatively simple book, and yet gives you a lot of overview of everything. And I've read a bunch of different things. I mean, there's so many different versions of books that are out there. It's hard to recommend just one or two, but those are the first two I would say because they're easy to read, they're small, and they're easy to understand, which I think makes them massively useful. When you're reading the bigger history books, sometimes it can get confusing because there's so much stuff thrown at you. The other thing is too is because they're published for the general public, they're generally cheaper, right? If you're writing for a more academic class of people, then the book is going to probably be thicker to start with. It's also going to be much more difficult, I would say, to read just because there's so much that you can talk about. But like I said, there's a lot of them. You can just do a quick search on Google or whatever, and you'll find that there's tons. Some of which are just fictional books. Some of which are actually proper history books, and some of which are just like overview books, like these ones I mentioned. And interestingly enough, one of the earliest introductions I got to Owen Glendower, it's not the earliest because, of course, the earliest introduction was the book I mentioned previously, because in the 80s, I got introduced to who he was at that point. And my next real big experience with him was a book written by Terry Brooks, which was a fantasy novel set in the modern day, but one of the characters in it is basically Owen Glendower, but he's effectively a superhero. I don't know how else to describe it. He's kind of the Arthur character of the story, and it's really good. And in that respect, it's kind of funny to read it from that way because you're like, okay, that's an interesting use for a character, but it's always whenever you have an incident where there's someone who's super famous, who's fought in wars, but his body's never found, and everybody believes he lives past the last battle he was ever in. There's always this mythology that then comes along about who they are and what they are, and could they come back at some point, blah, 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 blah. There's lots of examples of that throughout the history of humanity. So he's not new, but he was definitely one of those who got that kind of labeling. And so they take that idea and make it into an actual, like, here's a guy who just was hanging around and da da da. And now he's super powered mythological figure. Da 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 da. It's interesting, especially when you're like, why on earth is Terry Brooks writing about this? But obviously, he must have known about him because you don't usually bring in characters from history that you don't have any clue about. And I found it quite fascinating that suddenly he's in this book. So that was one thing. Series in question, if you're wondering where this comes from and actually want to follow it up for some reason, it's actually from Terry Brooks's A Night of the Word, which is, like I said, it's basically a fantasy novel. So there's a lot of interesting aspects to it. So if you're curious, Running with the Demon, I think, is the first one. And it does give you an overview of that. But it's just, like I said, he's a bit part character in the overall story, but he is in it. So, there you go. So if you're curious, there you go. There's a weird history sidebar. And there's lots of, one thing I found in researching Owen Glendower especially, and Llewellyn the Last and Llewellyn the Great, is that these characters, because they're so famous, in quote, they actually get a lot of fictional books written about them. And I'm not even talking about like history books that are more or less fictionalized. It's actual fictional books which have a bit of history in them. So they're the Downton Abbey version of Welsh history. And it's very interesting. I find it really curious that people do that. but I get it. I understand that these characters are intriguing. So trying to give them more life through a different method, I think is cool. As long as people understand that they're fictional books, I have no problem with that. I think that works. I think the problem is when you have a book which is obviously trying to be a history book or movie, and it's like not actually very historical. That's where I have more of a problem with it. But if you're just doing a obvious take on history that isn't actual history necessarily, I think that's okay. It's not as big of a deal. I always say it's easier for me to handle a history adjacent movie or book when I don't have to go in and say, oh, I don't know if I trust this. So, because they're not claiming to be a history movie. They're just saying, here's a good story. King Arthur's good fodder for that, actually, because everybody's got a version of it. King Arthur can be set all over the medieval period, and people don't really care because he's a mythological figure. So nobody's really bent out of shape if the history gets mangled because, I mean, if you are bothered by that kind of thing, I guess go ahead. But, if that doesn't bother you, you know, let's kind of move on now. We'll talk a little bit more about actual history writers who are writing larger books that may be something as you're drilling down into history and you're going, hey, I want to read this more in depth. I want to understand these characters and people from history a lot better. Then there are writers out there that are still writing, I think, very easy to read books, but they are heavy history. So if you're not wanting that, then don't buy them. But I think they have really, really well done versions of the characters. So what I find interesting with these kind of books is how many of them are actually, even with the English stories, they're written by people who at least have Welsh ancestry at some point. For example, Mark Morris is an author that has written A Great and Terrible King, Edward the First and the Forging of Britain, where it talks about Edward's experiences under his father, Henry III, and how that created the person who became Edward the First, and how he led the expansion of England into Wales and into Scotland at the time, and had a lot to do with developing the problems that we have now. And I think it's interesting to kind of see this because it's a good overview of that history, and it's very focused, and it talks about Wales as well as other places. It's not just about that. But I think in a way it's if you're wanting a perspective book, I think it's definitely good at that. It's one of those books that, like, it's on the bestseller book, blah 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 blah. And I think it gives you a good overview of his history. And so if you're wanting something in depth but it's still readable, and these are the kind of books that, because they're fairly modern, you can usually get audiobook versions if it's easier for you to listen to it on audio rather than read it. So I could recommend that. Next one, same thing on this list, and this author has tons of stuff. He's really good. I actually really like him. Other people may have different opinions, but I find his writing style to be really easily read. And I think because of that, it makes it easy to kind of go through. And I really used a lot of his book, the one I'm going to mention now, which is The Hollow Crown, which is The War of the Roses and the Rise of the Tudors. That is an excellent, easy reading book. And I know when I say easy reading, people are going to be like, what? But if you're looking at it from the aspect of, like, you want something that is academic, but isn't so academic it blows your mind, or isn't so academic it puts you to sleep, because there's that too, then these are the kind of books I would suggest, because they're good overviews. They're written in a modern voice, so you're not having to struggle with somebody translating in the 19th century or somebody who's writing in like the early, pre 1000 AD. And so they have a perspective that is understandable, and they're writing to be read by a larger population of people. They're not writing to be read by 8 people, in a library. And I think that's a really big deal, and it gives a very good overview in a very short amount of time. And when I mean short, to give you an idea, it's 500 pages. That's not huge, but it's much bigger than, say, the Owen Glyndwr books I was pointing out, which are much more compact stories. This is writing about a period of history over about a 200-year period. So, of course, it's going to be much bigger, and there's going to be a lot more things going on. But if you want an overview of the monarchy and how we ended up with a Welsh monarch on the throne, that's the book to read. I think it does a really good job of talking about that. And I think it's a very interesting book. Now, I'm kind of avoiding talking about modern books or more modern books simply because I haven't read a lot of them yet. I've read some and not enough to be like, I would recommend this one or that one, simply because I think I would rather have gone through the entire segment of the era and then comment, because there might be some that are better than others. There's some textbooks that I've bought in the past, which are good at giving me an overview, but I wouldn't call them good reads, because they can be a little bit thick in the way they're written. And there are books that talk about like Roman history, talking about Roman Britain specifically, that are really good. Now, if you're really big on wanting to get more archaeological and getting more in depth on a subject matter, there are definitely ones I could suggest. One of which that does give an overview of the history of Wales from the end of the Roman Empire until the beginnings of the High Middle Ages. So if you're really excited about that early medieval Welsh history, you want to know about the history of Wales from about 350, so sort of the end of the Roman period into the last king of Wales, then the only king of Wales, let's be honest, then this is definitely the book for you. It's slightly more expensive, so that's something to keep in mind. I don't believe there is an ebook version. There may be that I don't know about. It was written in 2014, and T.M. Charles Edwards is the author. He is very much a academic writer, writing it from an academic perspective, and it's published by Oxford. It is, without a doubt, a really good book. It's a really good overview of the history of Wales in that period. It makes it so simple to kind of follow along, but I say that, but the reality of it is it's broken down into segments. He travels from one to another to another. It isn't necessarily always, from the start of 350 AD to 1064. It doesn't go chronologically. It goes topically and thematically. So if you're struggling with that kind of thing, it may be too much. It is a lot of archaeological evidence in it. That's something, of course, you're always going to have in those circumstances. And it's very in depth. I totally recommend it because I think it offers a genuine academic understanding of an era which we don't have a lot of evidence for. And it does a really good job of combining the history that's written, the archaeology that's been found, and some of the work that's been done to try and identify why things became the way they are, and what makes them so scatterbrained and scattershot and so difficult to track, and fills in a little bit of the blanks. It's not always going to cover everything because it's impossible to do that, but it is really, really good. And if you're really looking for a book that goes in depth on this kind of stuff, that talks about the language, the kingdoms, the archaeology, and the movements of various peoples in and out of Wales at the time, then that's the book that I think works. It's not cheap. I will say that because it is an academic book and it's meant to be an academic book. And like, to give you an example, in Canada, the soft cover edition is $82. The hardcover is $250. So we're not talking cheap. Probably about $70 or maybe $65 for it in America, and slightly less, obviously, in pounds. But if you really want a book that's going to cover what you want, that's definitely the book to get. And I would highly, highly recommend it. It was really the source book for this series in those days. And I used a lot of books that came out from it, but it was always the book I went back to because there's so much of it that talks about the history of Wales. And I've talked this book up before in the past, but yeah, definitely worth it if you want to read an academic history book about that period. If you're really, really interested in the so-called Dark Ages in late antiquity or early Middle Ages in Britain, then that's definitely a book that gives you a great background in it and fills in some blanks and actually kind of leaves me wondering. It left me wondering about a lot of things that we don't necessarily have evidence for that would be interesting to know. Like, how much was Roman buildings revered after 100 to 200 years? Were they always basically used as sort of the sites where the leaders were set? Did they become ancient palaces? All of that kind of stuff became very fascinating because all of a sudden, you can understand these would be perceived by that generations that would come after in a very different light than the way they were perceived prior to that. And I think that it's always fascinating to kind of see the change in idea and understanding and concepts that happen in this period. This period is so fluid and so much changes in such a little amount of time. Well, I say little amount of time, but historically, not a little amount of time, but over time that bring about a lot of the concepts that we deal with today and a lot of the fighting that goes around that. So for me, that's definitely a book that I would always recommend. I always think it's one of those where it provides a ton of information and overview and gives you a much better sense of what's going on in a way. But again, it is heavily academic. It is very big. If you're not prepared to deal with that, then maybe that's not the book for you, but it is something I would suggest as being an interesting book. Now, as we've talked about books, I kind of want to move on a little bit and talk a little bit about YouTube, because of course a lot of people get their history from there, and I kind of wanted to bring up how to measure those kind of things, what to consider about those kind of things. Is there better or worse ideas? Because YouTube is filled with a lot of wonderful and great history related stuff, and then it's filled with a lot of not history pretending to be history or pretending to be something that they're not, and using in some cases AI to develop these things. So keep that in mind. You can't trust everything that comes out of there. I always say if you've got somebody who's doing the history themselves, that the voice is always the same, that it doesn't obviously sound robotic, that they're not screwing up words that they should be able to say. And I'm not talking about Welsh pronounced words that maybe someone like me wouldn't be able to say very well. I'm talking about basic word usage that suddenly it stumbles on randomly, or it says wrong, like maybe it says Leicester instead of Leicester, or maybe they Americanize stuff that shouldn't be, like Birmingham instead of Birmingham. Bear in mind that there is not a panacea of always good actors when it comes to the history on YouTube, and YouTube doesn't make it easy for history people to put stuff up. They quite consistently will actually restrict stuff. If you use a certain mustache man, as one of the ones that I watch says in your video, especially some of the symbols that go around that particular person, then that can actually get you demonetized, which is a big thing. And so YouTube has been infamous for doing stuff like that. And because of that, sometimes it kind of has washed away some of the better history because of that. So that's something to keep in mind. For me, if you want just a short, snappy thing that's just a generic history related thing, isn't necessarily specific to Wales, History Matters is one of my favorites. It's very small. It does a really good job of giving you a tiny snippet of history. And at one time they even did 10-minute histories of like things like, the early English history and Roman Britain and all of that kind of stuff. And it did stuff on Welsh history as well. Really good, really quick and concise and funny, which is always good. And I really like him. So I definitely would say if you're looking at something that's not typical and just want to take something away that maybe makes you think, uh, as well as makes you laugh, then that's definitely one to consider. From the Welsh perspective, one that I've been following a lot lately is the Cambrian Chronicles. That one is very good. It's from a Welsh person. So if that's something that you want to understand, who actually understands the subject quite well, has a bit of humor, self-deprecating stuff, which is kind of funny. And he offers a different take on various subjects. It's not specifically always built around a organized Welsh history. It's kind of all over the map. But if you're interested in just kind of diving into a subject, he's really good at talking about it. And he's done lots of stuff, which I think is interesting to kind of look at. And he goes in a lot more depth on some subjects that I would love to go in more depth, just haven't. And I think he's quite fascinating. And he does a lot on different subjects. So I think it's worth a watch if you're interested. And if you're looking for something which goes further into Welsh history than I do, and maybe offers a little different take on Welsh history than I do, then definitely this is someone to consider, because I think he offers a really good job. Another one that I've watched in the past and have, I don't want to say a love of, but I mean, I like his content, and I know that his content is actually becoming more public because he's ended up on BBC television now, and that's the Welsh Viking. And he does a really good job of talking about a bunch of different things. It is more general, but he still has Welsh content that he talks about, but quite often he's talking about just various things on medieval history, from Vikings to the Catholic Church to Welsh history to English history to all sorts of things. So really interesting, really good. He's a Welsh speaker, so that always can be helpful for some people. But yeah, he's not somebody who's talking necessarily about Welsh history specifically, although he does in some instances. So if you're interested in that, definitely look at it, and you might consider it to be good. That being the case, I really do want to thank everybody for listening and viewing today. I think this has been a reasonably good overview of kind of some of the things. It's not going to be a far and wide overview. But so just kind of wrapping this up, I just wanted to mention one other author. If you're looking at ancient Britain, before history, and you want, again, a good overview book, but it might be more complex, is Britain Begins. It's the first book I actually bought for this history series. So this book talks about the history of Britain from 12,000 years ago to the ending of the Middle Ages, like the beginning of the Middle Ages. And it's a very good book. It's a good overview of the history. It gives you some of the archaeology, obviously, because otherwise you're not filling any blanks in. And I would highly recommend it. It's relatively recently written, although I would suggest that Professor Cunliffe's books tend to have stuff that he's researched from 20, 30 years ago in it. That's not to say it isn't accurate or isn't good. It's just, if that's a book that you're like, oh, it's like a modern-ish, I guess is how I would describe it. But it's really a good book. I think it does a great job of covering those early days. And as an overview book, definitely works. It's also not very long by comparison to some books, but it is a big one, and you have to be aware that it's like 500 plus pages. So if that's not your cup of tea, if you're looking for something somewhat smaller, then you're going to have to look elsewhere. But I really like this book. It's also a big book, so you get a lot of graphs and charts and maps and imagery and stuff from like various museums that they've got photos of that they put into the book, which I think is very helpful. And it gives you a good overview of all those kind of things. So I highly recommend it. Really good. You can get it in ebook as well as physical. And here's the other part I just kind of want to end off with. And how do I get books? Where do I get them from? And again, I might have talked about this in the past, so sorry if this is a repeat for some of you. But largely I get my books from three sources. One, Amazon has been unfortunately very useful because a lot of the books I cannot find uh, here because, well, I'm in Edmonton, Canada. We don't really have a lot of Welsh books. I can find them through that. So that's first priority. Second, actually, has been through trolling through used bookstores and finding some of the things like the Chronicles of the Princes, which I ended up finding in a bookstore in town here. I also found an older Welsh history book that covered a period which I didn't have a lot of information on, and it worked really well for that. So it can be helpful sometimes just to have those kind of things. And then finally, there are other bookstores out and about. Half Price Books in the UK has a lot of stuff. There's a bunch of different ones out there. There's even now a small booksellers collective where they sell online, but it's from all the local small bookstores. Bookshop.org is definitely useful. So there is that kind of offering if you don't want to do the Amazon route. And if you're in the UK or Canada or the US, there are different companies you can use that also sell books that may have what you're looking for. And finally, I will recommend if you're looking for more academic books and you're wanting to get a hold of them, specifically for me with Welsh history, I definitely recommend the University of Wales Press. It is really good at having a lot of books covering a lot of topics, both inside and outside of Wales. And I think it is really, really good and does a really good job of covering a ton of topics, but it's all very academic in writing, so you have to be aware of that. But if you're wanting to get a hold of, LGBT Wales pride related stuff, you can get it from them. If you want to get, the history of early Jewish settlement in Wales, you can get that from them. If you want to get, an overview of, say, Welsh settlements in Patagonia, you can get it from there with varying degrees of opinions. All of that said, there are lots of sources to get it from. You don't have to rely on Amazon necessarily. I would recommend having a look around, but be aware if you're living in places where you're not necessarily close to Wales, likelihood is going to be you're going to end up going back to Amazon because of obvious reasons. Keep that in mind. But as I said, all the books I've recommended today, just a small smattering. Same thing with YouTube. There's lots of good people. I've just recommended 3 that I could think of off the top of my head, but there are a ton of different people that put out stuff. There's language related stuff as well, which if you're interested in trying to grow your understanding of the Welsh language, definitely do that. I know I've been doing more and more of it. And the government of Wales even has a website for this kind of stuff about learning Welsh, and they do courses. And if you're living in the UK or closer to the time zone, they actually have online courses with people, and it's not just learn on your own and struggle with it sort of thing. For me, my problem with it is it just happens to coincide with the afternoon quite frequently, or the morning, or even before that. So for me to take one of those courses, I would have to actually be taking them in Wales or somewhere near there to make it useful, just because of how far away I am. But they are really good. They also have books too, which you can buy, both hardcover and softcover books that help with language. So if that's something you're looking at, that's just a very, very broad overview. It's a bit rambly. I apologize, but I did want to kind of cover a few things and kind of give you a sneak understanding of where I came out of it and how I did my research. And maybe it helps you to do your own if you want to do your own and you don't want to just follow what the guy on the podcast says. That's definitely one way to go about it. And I would highly recommend doing your own look into these kind of things, especially if you have an interest that I have not covered properly. I mean, I know people who have wanted me to do stuff on, ghost stories and things like that, or spooky time stuff. And I'm probably not going to do a lot of that kind of thing. It's not really something I'm myself personally into, but also I don't think it's a history really. It's more of a mythological, legendary type stuff, which is great. And I may eventually have someone on who actually is interested and understands that stuff and can talk to it better than I can. I try and avoid that kind of thing just because it does flitter along a line I'm not very good at nor really interested in. And I don't want to give you kind of a poor understanding of. So there we are. That's today. If you haven't seen on social media, I was pointing out that we're doing Freeform today, regular podcast next week, back at the Welsh history stuff. And then we're going to do a quick little intro episode for the Roman Britain podcast, which is coming in September. And then we're back to schedule as normal after that. So the first Roman Britain podcast episode comes out on the beginning of September. And from there, we will go on as usual. We'll kind of go from there and we'll look at from that point on and kind of go ahead with that coordination where Freeform comes out a little earlier. But that's kind of the organized way I want to do this year and kind of get things going. So I'm hoping to do a bit more of that. I want to get into more of these topics. And next week is definitely going to be football/soccer, depending on where you live, related. And I hope you're interested as we begin the football season. It seemed appropriate. But anyway, until then, take care. Have a great day. Talk to you later. And if you have any questions, comments, or concerns, you can always reach me at the Welsh History Podcast at gmail.com or on any of my social media, save for Facebook at Welsh History Pod. On Facebook, you can reach me at the facebook.com/Welsh History Podcast. And of course, as always, we do have a Patreon. I would definitely appreciate any donations through the Patreon, and it's not required, obviously, but it does help the podcast out quite a bit, especially with purchasing these books, for example. And you can do that through patreon.com/Welsh History. Thank you, everyone. We'll talk to you later. Ta-ra for now. Bye-bye. Welsh History Podcast is a member of the Evergreen Podcast Network. To find more information on them, you can do so at evergreenpodcasts.com. Thanks for listening.